Welcome to Scoli Sleep Stories. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let the day soften around you and settle in for a calm documentary made for curious minds. If these stories help you rest, learn, or simply enjoy a quieter part of the day, please consider liking this episode and subscribing to the channel. Now, when you are ready, let us begin. Chapter 1. Before Dawn at Lucerne. Before dawn, Lake Lucerne lay dark and almost perfectly still. Along the shore, the lamps of the city made pale reflections upon the water. Each reflection seemed to descend into the lake, growing narrower and softer until it disappeared. The surrounding mountains were present only as deeper shapes against the sky. Their upper slopes had not yet received the first light, and their snowy ridges remained hidden in the blue-black distance. Close to the water stood Lucerne Station, quiet beneath its lamps. The city formed a natural northern approach to the Central Alps, a place where travelers might arrive by road, lake steamer, or railway before continuing toward the mountain passes. The station stood near enough to Lake Lucerne that, on a calm morning, one might sense the open water even before seeing it. At the far side of a platform, a steam locomotive waited. Our journey belonged to the atmosphere of the late steam era, sometime around the years from 1913 to 1920, when steam locomotives still worked over the Gotthard mountain line. It was an imagined heritage excursion through real Swiss railway geography, beginning in Lucerne, continuing toward Immensee, and then following landscapes associated with the historic Gotthard route. There was no crowd around the engine. Only a few railway workers moved quietly beside it, carrying shaded lanterns that cast small circles of amber light over the wheels, connecting rods and polished metal. The locomotive had been brought to life slowly. Inside its firebox, coal burned in an even red bed. The firebox was a strong chamber in the rear of the boiler, made to contain intense heat. From there, hot gases passed through many tubes running along the boiler. Water surrounded those tubes. As the heat passed through them, the water warmed and gradually became steam. Nothing about this process needed to be hurried. A cold locomotive required time. Its great mass of metal had to warm gradually, allowing the many parts to expand in a steady and even way. The crew had arrived while the city was still deeply quiet. They tended the coal, checked the water level, watched the instruments, and waited while pressure slowly gathered. Now a soft hiss came from a valve. It drifted into the cold air and faded. Then there was a small metallic tick from somewhere within the warming machinery. The sound was slight, but in the stillness of the station, it could be heard clearly. Metal expanded as it warmed. Drops of condensed water gathered beneath pipes. A thin wisp of steam curled beside the wheels and dissolved before reaching the edge of the platform. Behind the locomotive stood its tender, a separate vehicle coupled closely to the engine. The tender carried the two supplies upon which the locomotive depended: coal for the fire and water for the boiler. Its coal space rose in a dark mound, while most of the water remained hidden inside a large tank. During a journey, boiler water was steadily changed into steam, so fresh water had to be added. Yet the boiler was already under pressure. Water could not simply be poured into it by gravity. For this purpose, the locomotive used an injector, an ingenious device that employed steam itself to force fresh water into the pressurized boiler. The injector had few moving parts, but it performed a remarkable task. A fast jet of steam drew in water, carried it forward, and pushed it through a valve into the boiler. In this way, some of the locomotive's own steam helped renew the water from which still more steam would be made. Beside the driving wheels, a crew member held a lantern low. He examined the connecting rods, the bearings, and the joints where one piece of machinery met another. He moved without haste, pausing often. A little oil was applied wherever smooth movement would soon be needed. The bearings supporting the heavy shafts and rods had to remain properly lubricated. Each inspection was part of a familiar routine, repeated before departure and again at suitable stops along the way. The locomotive's power would soon pass through those rods. Pressurized steam from the boiler would enter cylinders near the wheels. Inside each cylinder was a piston. Steam admitted first to one side and then the other would drive the piston back and forth. The piston's straight movement would then pass through the connecting rods to the driving wheels, causing them to turn steadily along the rails. Near the warmth of the firebox, another shovelful of coal was placed precisely where it was needed. Skilled firing was measured work. It was not a matter of shoveling without pause. The firemen watched the condition of the fire, the steam pressure, the water level, and the demands that would soon be placed upon the engine. Coal was spread with care, allowing air to pass through the firebed so that heat could be produced evenly. When the locomotive began to move, exhaust steam leaving the cylinders would escape in regular pulses. Those pulses would help draw the hot gases through the boiler tubes and pull fresh air through the fire. The familiar beat of a working steam locomotive was therefore more than a sound. It was part of the engine's breathing. Fire, air, water, steam, movement, and exhaust were all linked together in one patient sequence. For now, however, the exhaust remained subdued. A valve whispered again, a soft hiss. Then came another quiet tick from the warming rods. Across the platform, the passenger carriages waited with their lamps already lit. Their windows glowed a muted gold. Inside were upholstered seats, polished wood, brass fittings, luggage racks, and curtains drawn partly against the darkness. The warmth of the compartments had softened the glass, leaving a faint mist near the corners of some windows. Beyond the station, Lucerne remained hushed. The lake held the first suggestion of a lighter sky. A church tower and several roofs slowly separated themselves from the darkness. Farther away, the mountains still seemed to belong to the night. The railway from Lucerne had not always offered a direct approach toward the Gotthard route. The line connecting the lakeside city toward Immensee opened in 1897. It gave trains a more direct path from Lucerne toward the great north-to-south railway across central Switzerland. From Immensee, the excursion would join the historic route leading toward the Reuss Valley and the high country beyond. Yet all of that still lay ahead. There would be rivers shaped by ice and meltwater, stone villages, spiral tunnels, deep snow, and the long passage beneath the Gotthard Pass. Here in Lucerne, preparation continued through small, dependable gestures. A worker walked beside the carriages, checking doors and couplings. Another adjusted a lamp. On the locomotive, the driver studied the gauges. Steam pressure had risen to the required level, slowly and without disturbance. The boiler water stood where it should. The fire was settled. The rods had been oiled, the bearings examined, and the tender supplied. The engine seemed quiet, yet it was not still in the manner of a cold machine. Warmth lived within it. Steam waited behind valves. Water moved gently inside the boiler. The fire gave a low red glow when the firebox door opened, and then the door closed once more. The passengers settled into their compartments. Coats were folded or drawn comfortably around shoulders. A bag was placed upon a luggage rack. Someone leaned near a window and looked across the platform toward the engine, where another pale wisp of steam rose into the dark. Within the carriage, the station sound seemed softened. Footsteps passed and faded. A door closed with a muted click. Farther ahead came the faint sound of metal touching metal as the locomotive waited against the weight of the train. Outside, the lake remained calm. The sky above it had begun to change almost imperceptibly, from blue-black to a deep shade of gray. The lamps along the shore still shone clearly, though their reflections no longer seemed quite as bright. Morning was approaching, gently and without announcement. At the end of the platform, a signal lamp changed. A quiet word passed between two members of the crew. The final carriage doors were closed, one after another, with softened clicks. A conductor raised his lantern. The locomotive answered with one restrained whistle. Its note traveled beneath the station roof and out toward the dark lake, where it faded among the first pale reflections of morning. For a moment, everything seemed to pause. Then steam entered the cylinders. The connecting rods tightened almost imperceptibly. A low breath passed beneath the engine, and the wheels took up the weight of the waiting carriages. The warm lamps continued to shine behind the windows, turning each compartment into a small and sheltered viewpoint. With a soft release of steam, and the first measured turn of its driving wheels, the train began to ease away from Lucerne. Chapter 2. Departure along the lake. The first movement was so gentle that inside the carriages, it seemed less like a departure than a quiet change in balance. The locomotive drew forward. The couplings between the carriages settled one after another, each with a small softened sound. A brass handle trembled. The fabric of a seat shifted beneath a passenger's hand. Outside, The platform began to pass slowly by the windows. First came the conductor with his lantern, then a waiting luggage cart, and then a row of pillars supporting the station roof. Beyond them rested the dim outline of Lucerne. The locomotive released a low breath of steam. Its driving wheels turned again, and the whole train gathered itself into a patient rhythm. There was no need for haste. This was an imagined heritage excursion, following real Swiss geography and recalling an earlier age of railway travel, rather than a regular modern steam service. The engine had all the morning before it, and the mountains would arrive in their own time. Within the compartment, the air was comfortably warm. Upholstery softened the wooden seats, and polished panels reflected the glow of the carriage lamps. Depending on the date and design of such a carriage, its original lighting might have been supplied by gas or electricity. Here, it was enough to notice the gentle warmth of the lamps. Small amber circles shone through glass above brass fittings and dark varnished wood. The wheels passed over the first points beyond the station, and their sound changed as the rails divided and met beneath them. A light tapping became a close pattern of knocks. Then it returned to a quiet rolling murmur. Railway wheels never made only one sound. Their voices changed with speed, curves, bridges, points, rail joints, and the condition of the track. Over a crossing, the rhythm grew intricate. Along a smoother section, it softened. When the locomotive entered a broad curve, the flanges along the inner edges of the wheels sometimes added a faint singing note against the steel. Ahead, a steam exhaust marked the work of the engine. Breath and pause, breath and pause. At first, the beats were widely spaced. As the train began to move more freely, they gathered into a dependable sequence. Each release of exhaust followed the movement of steam through the cylinders. Pressure pushed the pistons moved the rods, and the rods turned the driving wheels. What had been stored as heat and pressure in Lucerne was becoming steady forward motion. The station roof slipped behind. Morning had not yet fully reached the streets. A few windows shone above quiet lanes. Lamps stood beside walls and doorways, their light softened by the faint moisture in the air. There might have been a little snow in sheltered corners, or perhaps only pale frost along roofs and garden edges. Deep winter snow waded farther into the Alps. The city itself did not need to be white for the high mountain country to carry a thick covering. The railway curved through the outskirts, where buildings opened now and then to reveal a glimpse of water. Lake Lucerne did not remain continuously beside the train. Instead, it appeared in intervals. A dark bay showed between houses. A silver surface rested beyond bare trees. A narrow reflection gleamed beneath the gradually paling sky. Then the water disappeared again behind a wooded slope or a cluster of roofs. This made each glimpse feel quietly distinct. For a moment, part of the lake lay open beneath the mountains, almost without color. A few lights along the shore stretched into thin, wavering lines. From the carriage window, the surface seemed still. Those small ripples must have been touching the stones and landing stages. Then the train entered a cutting, and rock and trees replaced the open water. Inside the compartment, a coat hung from a brass hook. A folded timetable rested beside the window. Although this journey seemed to belong less to minutes and to places, Lucerne was now behind. Immensee waited ahead. Beyond it lay the long approach to the Gotthard route. The railway connection from Lucerne toward Immensee and the Gotthard line opened in 1897. It provided a more direct link from the city toward the Great North-to-South Railway. Before that connection opened, travelers and goods had used other routes to reach the Gotthard line. The new approach joined Lucerne more closely to the railway leading through the Central Alps and onward toward the Italian-speaking south. The steam locomotive carried this history lightly. Its exhaust did not announce dates, maps, or diagrams. It simply continued its measured work. The country outside grew more varied. Fields lay beyond fences, their winter grasses muted in the early light. Farmhouses stood beneath broad roofs, with dark barns nearby. In shallow hollows, a little mist rested close to the ground. Wooded slopes rose behind the farms, covered with fir trees and the fine, bare branches of winter woodland. At a small station, the train passed a sheltered platform without stopping. A clock showed the early hour, A lamp beneath the eaves illuminated a bench, a doorway, and a waiting luggage cart. For a few seconds, every detail was clear. Then the platform slipped away, and the windows returned to fields and trees. The train crossed a short bridge. Beneath the carriage came a firmer and more resonant rolling sound, as though the wheels had briefly entered a chamber of steel and stone. It lasted only a moment. On the far side, the sound softened again and blended with the subdued clink of a cup in its holder. Morning gradually entered the compartment. The carriage lamps continued to shine, but their reflections in the windows became fainter. It was now possible to see more clearly the grain of the polished wood, the stitching in the upholstery, and the fine marks left by years of careful use. Beyond the glass, another opening revealed water. Its surface had changed from blue-black to gray. A village gathered around a church tower, and a few buildings stood quietly near the shore. Distant mountain forms rose one behind another, each softened by the cool air and the growing light. Once more, trees closed across the view. The locomotive worked a little more firmly as the line rose and curved. Steam drifted back beside the carriages, briefly whitening the lower windows before thinning into the cold air. The exhaust beats drew closer together. When the gradient eased, they relaxed once more. Breath and pause. The railway from Lucerne approached Immensee through a landscape of settlements, farmland, wooded slopes, and occasional views of water. It was not a simple journey along an unbroken shoreline. Bays appeared between buildings, reflections shone beyond trees, then the line turned inland again, allowing hills, fields, and villages to fill the windows. At Immensee, the journey joined the older course of the Gotthard Railway. Tracks approached one another, aligned, and continued southward. Signals stood beside the rails, guiding trains through the junction. The wheels spoke rapidly over the points, sending a measured sequence beneath the floor, while the carriages answered with an easy sway. The train continued toward Arth-Goldau, another important meeting place in the railway network. Here, routes from Lucerne, Zurich, and eastern Switzerland met the Gotthard line before turning toward the mountains. A junction was like a careful knot tied in steel. Passengers changed trains, mail and luggage were transferred, locomotives and carriages were directed onto the proper tracks. Goods wagons waited in sidings before continuing toward places far beyond the visible valleys. Our excursion moved through without urgency. Platforms, lamps, signals, sidings, and railway buildings appeared in the growing daylight. A worker stood beside a doorway, watching the passing carriages. Wisps of steam drifted low along the track and slowly faded between the rails. Inside, the compartment remained sheltered and warm. The wooden panels held the lamplight. Brass fittings gave back small points of amber. Outside was the cool beginning of a winter morning. Inside were soft seats, still air, and the quiet companionship of the wheels below. Their rhythm continued to change, a subdued murmur on smooth rail, a fuller sound over a bridge, a brief sequence over points, a faint metallic note around a curve. Above it all came the patient breathing of the locomotive, steady enough to follow without effort. Beyond Arth-Goldau, the open views began to feel less frequent. Rising ground gathered around the line. The broad northern landscape slowly folded into hillsides and woodland. Houses stood farther apart, and the mountains ahead took on clearer shapes beneath their winter covering. The lake appeared only in occasional glimpses now, farther away or partly hidden. A brightness between trees suggested water. A brief open view caught the pale morning sky. Then the land closed gently around the railway once again. Somewhere beyond the slopes, streams were following their own quiet paths through the country. The train was turning toward the valley of the Reuss, a river fed by mountain streams, snowmelt, and rain. Its water traveled northward toward Lake Lucerne, while the steam excursion proceeded southward and gently uphill, following the railway toward the heart of the Alps. Behind the warm glass, the wheels continued their changing song. The scattered lake views fell farther apart. The land rose calmly on either side, and ahead the river valley began to open. Chapter 3. The Reuss Valley. South of Flüelen, the railway entered the valley of the Reuss and began to follow the river upstream. The train moved south while the water flowed north, each keeping to its own direction through the same long passage between the mountains. From the carriage window, the river appeared and disappeared behind bare trees, low embankments, and clusters of houses. Where it came fully into view, its surface was a quiet gray-green, touched here and there by pale morning light. The current carried cold water toward Lake Lucerne, gathering the flow of smaller streams along the way. Farther south, in the Gotthard region, the Reuss began among high ground fed by mountain water, rain, and melting snow. The railway climbed so gradually that the change could be felt more in the steady work of the locomotive than in any clear rise of the track. Its exhaust settled into an even measure. Turn, breathe, turn, breathe. A faint veil of steam passed the windows and drifted away. Beneath the carriage the wheels kept their regular rhythm, softer on open track and briefly louder beside stone walls. The valley was broad enough here for farms and small fields. Dark-roofed barns stood near houses with shuttered windows. Narrow lanes crossed the fields, sometimes leading toward a village, and sometimes disappearing behind a line of trees. Stacked timber and sheltered farm buildings suggested winter routines continuing quietly through the colder months. Church towers rose above several settlements. Their simple shapes provided steady points in the landscape, while the nearby roofs seemed to slide slowly past. From one village came the distant sound of a bell. A single note traveled across the valley floor, followed after a pause by another. Then the sound faded, leaving the river and railway to continue their separate murmurs. The valley itself held a much older story. Over long periods, the alpine landscape had been shaped by more than one force. During the ice ages, glaciers filled many mountain valleys. A glacier is a great body of ice, formed where snow gathers and is gradually pressed into denser layers. Although its movement may be almost impossible to notice from day to day, a glacier can reshape the land through its weight and slow motion. In the Reuss Valley, ancient ice helped to widen and deepen parts of the passage between the mountains. It moved over the ground, carrying fragments of rock within it and beneath it. This work was not completed in one winter, or even within many human lifetimes. It unfolded through long ages of cold, pressure, and movement. When the glaciers retreated, flowing water continued to shape the valley. Rivers cut channels through loose material and carried sand, gravel, and stones downstream. Meltwater joined mountain springs and rainfall. Side streams descended from the slopes, sometimes spreading gravel across the valley floor in broad, gently sloping fans. Rockfall brought more material down from above. And so, the scene beyond the window had no single maker. Ice, running water, weather, and falling stone had all played their part. Human hands had shaped the valley too, creating fields, paths, bridges, roads, walls, and eventually, the railway. The train passed a smaller stream where it crossed beneath the line on its way toward the Reuss. Its channel was lined with pale stones. Some had been rounded by water, while others still held sharper edges. Near the foot of the slope, gravel spread outward in a shallow fan before meeting the flatter land of the valley floor. Above it, woodland covered the lower mountainsides. Fir trees kept their deep green through winter, while leafless branches formed fine gray patterns between them. Snow rested in sheltered hollows and beneath shaded trees. Scattered white patches remained along the edges of fields, where the morning sun had not yet reached. Higher up, the snow became more continuous. It traced ledges and shallow gullies, giving the mountains a softly layered appearance. Yet the train remained comfortably low in the valley. Farms, roads, and village streets still lay close beside the railway. Near a fence, a solitary figure paused to watch the steam locomotive pass, then continued along the lane. People had traveled through this region long before steel rails were laid. The Gotthard route already connected communities on the northern and southern sides of the mountains. Early travelers followed footpaths and mule routes. They crossed bridges and used narrow ways beside rivers. Later, carriage roads made some journeys easier, though a passage through the Alps still required time, patience, and preparation. The Gotthard was an important alpine crossing, but it was not Switzerland's only one. Other historic routes linked different valleys, regions, and destinations. Together, these crossings formed a network of movement through the mountains, rather than a single doorway from north to south. When the railway arrived, it did not create this movement. Instead, it transformed a pattern of travel that was already centuries old. Trains could carry more passengers and much greater quantities of freight than mule trains or carriages. Journeys became faster and more regular. Goods could pass through the Alps in railway wagons, while travelers sat within enclosed carriages, sheltered from much of the mountain weather. The heritage excursion now followed that railway, its steam locomotive recalling an earlier age of rail travel. Beside the line, newer houses stood near older barns. Roads crossed former pathways. Signals and cables followed parts of the route. Each period had added another layer to the inhabited valley. Inside the carriage, warm lamps remained lit, although the morning had grown brighter. Their glow rested softly on polished wood and brass fittings. A folded coat lay on the seat opposite the window. On a small table, a cup trembled almost imperceptibly with the motion of the wheels. Outside, the Reuss widened briefly around a gravel bank. The current divided, passed quietly on either side, and joined again. The river continued north toward Lake Lucerne, while the train moved against its direction, southward and gently uphill, toward the region where the water began. Another bell sounded across the fields. This one was lower and more distant. It might have come from a church tower, or from an animal somewhere beyond the nearest barns. There was a long space after it, filled only by the measured breathing of the locomotive. Turn, breathe, turn, breathe. The wheels carried the train onward, and the river slipped past in the opposite direction. Between them lay fields, lanes, stone walls, and the quiet traces of journeys made long before the railway came. The sides of the valley drew closer. Exposed stone appeared more often beside the track, and retaining walls supported the slopes where level ground became less plentiful. The Reuss remained nearby, sometimes calm and open, sometimes gathered into a narrower channel. The railway's purpose was becoming clearer. This was no longer only a line between farms and villages. It was approaching the great north-south passage through the Alps, where careful engineering had allowed trains to climb toward higher ground. Ahead lay Erstfeld, long known as the traditional threshold of the Gotthard ascent. There, locomotives, water, brakes, and experienced crews would all have their part. The easy progress along the valley floor would give way to the more deliberate work of the mountain railway. For now there was no need to hurry toward it. The train continued beside the river. Farms and church towers slipped gently behind. Snow rested on shaded fields and wooded slopes. The valley narrowed almost too slowly to notice, while the morning light moved down from the high ground. And all the while, the Reuss flowed steadily north toward the lake, as the railway followed it south, deeper into the quiet architecture of the Alps. Chapter 4. Erstfeld and the Mountain Engine. The first signs of Erstfeld appeared gradually. Sidings spread beside the main line, their polished rails dividing and joining beneath the pale morning sky. Low railway buildings stood near workshops and sheds, while signal posts watched over the converging tracks. Beyond them, the valley narrowed toward mountains whose upper slopes were softened by snow. The locomotive gave a muted whistle. Its voice crossed the station yard and returned faintly from the hillside. Erstfeld had long been known as the northern gateway to the Gotthard Mountain Railway. Trains arriving from the gentler country around Lake Lucerne paused here before beginning the sustained ascent. The station was more than a place where passengers stepped down or climbed aboard. It was a working railway center, with a locomotive depot closely associated with the engines used on the mountain section. The excursion rolled slowly beside the platform. Its wheels passed over the points in a quiet sequence of clicks. The engine released a white cloud around its cylinders, and then the coaches came to rest beneath the station clock. For a little while, nothing seemed to hurry. A station worker walked along the train, glancing at doors and couplings. Another stood near the locomotive with a lantern, though the growing daylight had begun to make its flame unnecessary. Beneath the platform roof, a luggage cart waited, with its handles resting on the paving stones. The station windows reflected drifting steam, patches of snow, and the warm lamps inside the carriages. The engine that had brought the train from Lucerne remained coupled at the front. Its fire was steady, and its tender still carried coal and water. Yet the climb ahead asked for more than the easy progress of a journey along the valley floor. On a nearby siding, a second locomotive waited. It was an SBB C56, one of the largest and most powerful Swiss steam locomotive types. The C56 entered service from 1913 onward, and railway crews and admirers gave these engines an affectionate nickname. They called them elephants. The name suited their great size and their deep, deliberate manner. They had been designed principally for heavy freight trains, But an elephant could also lend its strength to a special heritage passenger excursion such as this one. A breath of steam drifted from beneath the dark frame. Then the elephant began to move. Its driving wheels turned almost imperceptibly at first, carrying the engine through a set of points and onto the excursion's track. A worker on the ground guided the movement with calm hand signals. One motion invited the locomotive backward. A smaller gesture asked for less speed. The driver leaned from the cab and watched attentively. The C-56 approached the waiting train and stopped ahead of the original locomotive. Only a short space remained between the two engines. After another signal, the elephant eased backward over the final distance. The buffers met with a cushioned touch. The coupling was secured, and the necessary connections were inspected. Soon the two locomotives had become one working pair. The elephant would lead, while the original engine remained immediately behind it and continued to assist. Together, they would draw the coaches toward the higher reaches of the Gotthard route. This arrangement recalled an earlier age of mountain railroading. Before more powerful designs such as the C-56 were available, heavy trains on the Gotthard climb often needed 2 steam locomotives, and sometimes 3. Powerful engines later reduced the need for so many locomotives, though they did not always remove it. A heavy load or difficult conditions could still make assistance useful. The reason was simple. A train climbing for mile after mile must continually work against gravity. Curves also add resistance, and the mountain railway follows many curves as it seeks a gradual way through steep country. The effort is not a brief push over a single hill. It continues steadily, calling for a dependable supply of steam and careful attention from the crews. Even here, the rails themselves were ordinary rails. The old Gotthard Mountain Railway is an adhesion railway, not a rack railway. There is no toothed rail between the running rails and no cogwheel beneath the locomotive. Ordinary steel driving wheels grip ordinary steel rails. That contact may seem modest, yet it can move immense weight when it is managed well. The driver applies power carefully so that the wheels continue to hold the rail. Boiler pressure must be maintained, and the fire must produce heat evenly. Adhesion, timing, judgment, communication, and close knowledge of the route all matter. Strength alone is never enough. Beside the leading engine, railway workers prepared its supplies. A water crane swung over the tender, and its broad pipe was lowered into the filling opening. Water began to flow with a hollow, rushing sound. A preserved C-5/6 carried about 18 cubic meters of water in its tender, together with around 8 tons of coal. Such large supplies were necessary because a steam locomotive used both water and coal as it worked. Coal heated the firebox, and the fire heated the water in the boiler. The resulting steam pressed against the pistons. Rods then carried that motion to the driving wheels. Water continued to enter the tender, while a thin mist settled over the nearby metalwork. The firemen examined the coal space and checked the tools arranged in the cab. Beneath the fading glow of a lantern, another crew member walked beside the wheels, looking over the rods, bearings, and brake equipment. These inspections were quiet and methodical. Each practiced glance belonged to a routine shaped by many journeys. The climb ahead required careful boiler management and a clear understanding of every change in the line. The later descent would ask for equally disciplined braking. A skilled crew did not wait for a train to gather too much speed before slowing it. Brakes were applied early and adjusted gradually so that the train remained controlled from the beginning. Route knowledge told the crew where the gradient changed, where a curve tightened, and where gentle restraint should begin before it seemed necessary to an inexperienced traveler. Drivers, firemen, guards, and station staff brought these skills together through hand signals, whistles, and spoken confirmations. Each person held one part of the journey, and all those parts worked quietly as one. At last the water pipe was lifted clear. A final stream fell into the tender, and then ceased. The crane swung slowly back from the track. Steam drifted around the paired locomotives, mingling in the cold air until it was difficult to tell which engine had breathed out each white cloud. The original locomotive waited behind the elephant, its familiar sounds now joined by the lower murmur of the larger engine. A carriage door closed gently. The guard consulted the station clock. Farther along the track, beyond the waiting points, a green signal gave permission to proceed. The elephant answered with a low exhaust note, deeper than that of the engine behind it. It sounded once, and then again, becoming a new pulse beneath the familiar rhythm of the train. The second locomotive took up its share of the effort. Along the coaches, the couplings settled one after another, each with a softened touch. A final hand signal was given. The guard's whistle sounded, followed by the restrained reply of the leading engine. Then the two locomotives began their measured work. Erstfeld's platform moved slowly past the windows. The station buildings followed, then the depot, the sidings, and the silent water crane. Workers remained beside the rails for a moment, watching the excursion depart, before steam drifted across the view and gently hid them. Ahead the line leaned steadily upward toward Amsteg and Gurtnellen, and farther on toward the remarkable loops near Wassen. The valley walls gathered closer. Snow rested in the shaded folds of the slopes. All the Ruas continued beside the railway, carrying mountain water northward. The train moved south and upward. At its head, the elephant settled into a deep, even rhythm. The original locomotive answered from just behind it, and the two engines breathed together. The couplings rested under their steady pull. The wheels resumed their quiet conversation with the rails. Behind them, Erstfeld gradually receded, and before them, the long Gotthard climb began. Chapter 5. Climbing toward Wassen. Beyond Erstfeld, the two locomotives settled into a shared, measured rhythm. The elephant led with a deep breath from its chimney, and the smaller engine followed with a softer answer. Together they drew the carriages into the narrowing valley. The sound of their exhaust had changed since the gentler country beside Lake Lucerne. Each beat was slower and more distinct. Breath, pause, breath, pause. There was no hurry. The engines were simply applying steady power against the long incline. Outside, the Reuss moved in opposite direction, descending northward over its stony bed. Pale water passed around dark rocks, gathering streams from the slopes. The railway climbed southward beside it, sometimes near the river and sometimes higher upon the valley wall. Small houses stood among snow-touched fields, beneath dark forests and white upper ridges. A direct railway through this country would have been difficult. The upper Reuss Valley rises too much in too short a distance. Steam locomotives could pull heavy trains uphill, but worked best when the slope remained moderate. On the original Gotthard mountain line, engineers generally kept the gradient to about 25 or 26 parts in 1,000, roughly 25 meters of rise for every 1,000 meters traveled, or 2.5%. It was a serious climb for a heavy train, yet far gentler than the mountainside. To preserve that manageable slope, engineers gave the railway more distance. Instead of pointing the rails directly uphill, they laid broad curves across and within the mountains. The route bent into side valleys, turned through tunnels, and returned at a higher level. The train kept moving forward even when its apparent direction changed. The first great turn lay north of Wassen, in the Pfaffensprung spiral tunnel. The valley wall approached the windows. Snow rested on ledges, and dark evergreens and stonework passed close by. Then daylight folded quietly away. Warm carriage lamps shone in the glass, which became a dark mirror for seats, brass fittings, winter coats, and peaceful faces. Around the curve, the wheels made a low murmur, their flanges brushing softly against the rails. The exhaust returned from the tunnel walls. Breath, echo, breath, echo. The line curved broadly within the mountain. It was not a corkscrew twisting up a narrow shaft, nor were its floors coiled closely above one another. The railway used a wide, practical curve to gain height gradually. Inside, the lamps remained steady. Seats gave an occasional creak, and rails sounded beneath the floor. Daylight returned. The river seemed farther below, and houses stood at a different angle. A landscape seen only minutes earlier now appeared from higher ground as the train continued toward Wassen. The village gathered on the slope ahead, its pale walls and dark roofs arranged above the Reuss. On a rise stood the church of St. Gallus, rebuilt in 1734. Its white tower and pointed roof formed a clear landmark against the snow. For generations of Gotthard passengers, the church had been a familiar companion. A traveler might glance up from a book or lower a teacup and discover its tower returning to the window. Someone unfamiliar with the route could wonder whether several similar churches stood around Wassen. There was only one. It appeared repeatedly because the railway was turning and climbing. The line bent away, and the tower slipped behind rock. After a short open stretch beneath the pale sky, another passage replaced the snowy world with amber reflections. Near Wassen, the Waddingen and Leggestein loop tunnels formed part of the remarkable arrangement. With the surrounding curves and the Pfaffensprung spiral farther north, they helped the line gain roughly 200 meters in height. Inside the next tunnel, the motion remained even. Cups rested on their saucers, while a folded newspaper shifted only slightly with the curve. Ahead, the crews watched their gauges and listened to the locomotives. Steam pressure, water level, fire, speed, and the feel of the rails belonged to the calm routine of ascent. Coal was added in measured amounts. Boiler water absorbed the fire's heat and became steam. Steam moved the pistons, and the pistons turned the driving wheels. Each action joined the next, becoming the slow, dependable movement of the train. Then the tunnel released the carriages into daylight. Across the valley, the church of St. Gallus returned, seen from another direction and at a greater height. The tower that had stood above the train seemed nearer its level. Village roofs gathered below, and the river had narrowed to a silver ribbon. The changing view made the climb visible. A gradient of 2.5% could feel almost level to someone resting in a carriage, but the church offered a quiet measure. Each time it appeared, the train had climbed farther. The rails curved again. For a while the train seemed to travel back toward country it had crossed, though it was still progressing south. The loop had changed its direction, not its destination. Steam drifted past the windows in white folds, mingled briefly with the snow, and faded into the mountain air. The locomotives maintained their unhurried conversation. The elephant spoke in deep separated beats. The second engine answered just ahead of the carriages. On the curve, the wheels added a smooth metallic murmur. Beneath it was the steady click of the rails, counting distance one short length at a time. Another tunnel offered a restful interval of darkness. Small lights appeared and vanished beyond the glass. The carriage became a warm room traveling through the mountain, while the railway continued its wide turn. Breath echo. Breath echo. When the open valley returned, so did the church. It stood farther below. Chapter 6. Snow beside the track. Beyond Wassen, the snow lay more deeply beside the railway. It filled the hollows between stones, and softened the edges of retaining walls. On shaded ground, it rested in smooth, pale folds. Where a little winter sunlight reached the valley, dark grass and rock still showed through. The two locomotives moved steadily onward. Their wheels pressed the rails with a measured turning sound, while small clouds of steam drifted low beside the train. Fine powder lifted near the wheels, hovered for a moment, and settled again. An occasional snowflake touched the warm carriage glass and became a clear bead of water. Inside, the lamps shone gently. Coats hung from brass hooks, and the varnished woodwork held a comfortable warmth. Beyond the windows, fir trees stood along the slopes, their branches carrying narrow white ridges. Now and then, a branch released a soft veil of snow, which floated downward through the still air. Winter gave the railway a different appearance, but the line had been built with winter in mind. A mountain railway required more than locomotives, bridges, and tunnels. It also needed fences, drains, shelters, tools, and the patient work of people who understood how snow gathered and moved. In open places, wind could carry loose snow across the track and shape it into drifts. Snow fences helped to reduce this. Placed at a careful distance from the railway, they interrupted the wind and encouraged drifting snow to settle before it reached the rails. Their purpose was simple, although their position required experience and close knowledge of the land. Where snow had already accumulated, railway plows could clear a path. Some were wedge-shaped, pushing the snow toward both sides. Others were made for heavier work. Yet no plow could promise that every train would pass through every winter condition without delay. Snow might fall faster than it could be removed, and wind could fill a newly cleared cutting once again. In difficult conditions, the safest choice was sometimes to wait, or to close a section of the route until it could be examined and cleared. The mountain railway depended upon sound judgment as much as it depended upon machinery. Near a small trackside building, the train passed several railway workers. They stood safely away from the active line, with their tools gathered beside them. Earlier they had cleared the points, the movable rails that guide trains from one track to another. Snow and ice around these parts had to be removed carefully so that the rails could move fully into position. Other winter duties were equally practical. Platforms needed clearing, drains had to remain open so that meltwater would not collect and freeze. Signal equipment required inspection. Steps, walkways, and access paths had to be kept usable for station staff and train crews. Such work was often repetitive, but its value lay in that repetition. A dependable railway was maintained through many small tasks, each completed patiently and in an orderly way. The workers of the historic mountain railway did not have modern radar, remote sensors, or present-day avalanche forecasts. They relied upon local knowledge, reports from along the line, direct observation, and long familiarity with the surrounding slopes. They noticed recent snowfall, changing temperatures, wind, and the appearance of known snowpaths. Their methods belonged to their own time, and they worked carefully within what could then be understood. Modern alpine railways have added further tools. Weather forecasting, remote instruments, organized observation, and temporary closures can all help railway managers make careful decisions. In some places, controlled avalanche release is used to bring down unstable snow at a chosen time, while routes are closed and secured. These modern methods improve planning, although mountain weather is still treated with patience and respect. Ahead, a dark roof extended over the track. The leading locomotive entered beneath it, and the sound changed. The exhaust became rounder and softer, repeating beneath heavy beams and stone supports. The click of the wheels returned as a low echo. Warm carriage lamps glowed against the sheltered walls. This was a protective gallery, sometimes called a snow shed or an avalanche gallery. It was not quite a tunnel, for openings remained along one side, allowing pale daylight to enter. Its strong roof covered an exposed stretch of railway. Snow and loose material descending the slope could pass above, while the rails remained sheltered below. The gallery formed a calm corridor through the mountainside. From the carriage, the passengers could see alternating bands of shadow and light between the supports. Meltwater tapped somewhere overhead, then ran through channels toward the valley. Steam gathered briefly under the roof before drifting outward through the openings. The train emerged into daylight, and the sounds widened once more. Snow covered the roof of the gallery behind them, making the shelter seem almost a part of the slope itself. Between Gürtenellen and Goschenen, more than half a dozen protective galleries were built over time. They did not all appear at once. As railway experience accumulated, exposed places were studied, structures were improved, and additional shelter was provided. Each gallery represented observation made practical. One slope gathered snow in a certain way, another channel carried meltwater toward the line. A particular stretch of track benefited from a strong roof. Slowly, knowledge of the mountain became part of the railway's design. The galleries reduced the railway's exposure, though they could not make the route completely immune to winter conditions. Snow still gathered at entrances and upon roofs. Drains still required attention. The track beyond every protected section still had to be inspected. Protection in the mountains was rarely a single measure. It was a quiet system of shelters, fences, plows, maintenance, observation, and careful decisions. Each part supported the others. A second gallery approached. Its entrance was rimmed with snow, and small icicles hung beyond the reach of the locomotives. Once more, the train passed beneath the roof. The pistons continued their patient motion. The rails murmured under the wheels. Drops of meltwater made a light, uneven tapping overhead. For a little while, the windows reflected the carriage interior more strongly than the landscape. Brass fittings, dark upholstery, and resting faces floated against the dim outlines of stone. Then the openings between the supports revealed the valley again, with the Reuss far below, moving through its winter channel. Outside the shelter, the snow seemed brighter. It rested upon fir branches, station roofs, platforms, and the flat tops of signal boxes. A cleared path formed a neat, dark line between low banks of white. A luggage cart waited beneath an awning, its wheels kept dry and free of snow. The locomotives continued at their deliberate mountain pace. Their work was steady rather than hurried. Each breath of steam was followed by another, and each protected stretch arrived in its turn. gallery roof, open snow, stone wall, and fir trees. Then another gallery, where the sound of the train became sheltered and close. Then daylight again, pale upon the valley. Fine powder stirred beside the wheels, snowflakes touched the windows and melted. On the branches above the track, the white covering lay quiet and undisturbed. The train passed another short protected section. Beneath its roof the exhaust softened, and the rhythm of the rails became a gentle echo. Meltwater tapped in a narrow channel. Beyond the openings the snowy valley appeared in brief, evenly spaced views. Then the roof ended, and the winter air opened around the train once more. Behind them, railway workers continued their measured routines. Points, drains, platforms, signals, and paths would all be checked again as the season required. Plows would clear accumulated snow when conditions allowed. Fences would help to limit the drifts. Galleries would shelter the exposed rails beneath their strong roofs. And when the mountain required patience, the railway would wait. Gradually, the sides of the valley drew inward. The higher slopes seemed to gather around the line, while the river and road followed the narrowing land below. Snow rested in the folds of the mountain and along the old routes that had crossed this region for centuries. Above the railway, those older roads climbed toward the Gotthard Pass, rising by patient bends into the white heights. The train followed a newer path, protected by engineering and tended through winter by careful hands. The galleries passed one by one behind it. Their dark entrances grew smaller, then disappeared among the walls, trees, and snow. Ahead lay Göschenen, gathered quietly beneath the mountains. Beyond the station roofs, at the foot of the snowy slope, a stone portal waited in the pale winter air. Chapter 7. Göschenen, Beneath the Pass. The roofs of Göschenen appeared beneath the snow, gathered close to the railway in the narrowing valley. Chimneys rose between the pale slopes, and a few threads of smoke drifted almost straight upward in the still winter air. Below, the river Reuss continued on its way among dark stones, carrying the cold water down from the mountains. The locomotive approached with a measured breath. Steam curled around its wheels and trailed behind in a low white cloud. The rails were damp where passing engines had warmed the snow, and the station lamps cast long, wavering reflections across the metal. Beyond the platforms, beneath the immense quiet shape of the mountain, waited the northern portal of the original Gotthard railway tunnel. A restrained whistle sounded. It was not a call of urgency, but a familiar railway greeting. The note crossed the station yard, touched the stone buildings, and faded toward the upper valley. A porter turned beneath one of the lamps. Farther along the track, a signalman watched the approaching train, then returned his attention to the points and signals under his care. The coaches passed beneath the station canopy. Their wheels clicked more slowly over the rail joints. Faces appeared at the windows, softened by glass and lamplight. Then the locomotive released a gentle sigh. The couplings settled one after another, and the train came quietly to rest. Göschenen stood at a meeting place of old journeys and newer ones. Long before rails reached this valley, travelers crossed the Alps by climbing toward the Gotthard Pass above. From the Reuss Valley, routes led through the nearby Schollenen Gorge to Andermatt, and from there toward the high pass. Travelers followed those mountain ways at the pace of hooves and footsteps, moving carefully between valleys and ridges. Now, above the station, the older pass route seemed to be sleeping beneath the winter snow. Its patient bends climbed beyond the houses and disappeared among the folds of the mountain. In warmer seasons, travelers had followed those turns toward the heights. In winter, snow could make the crossing difficult or close the route for a time. The railway offered another way through the Alps. Rather than climbing over the highest ridge, it entered the mountain itself. During the building of the original Gotthard railway tunnel, Göschenen changed greatly. It became a construction settlement, with workers, workshops, storehouses, offices, tools, and equipment. Supplies arrived and were carried toward the tunnel works. The mountain community became closely connected with one of the great railway projects of the 19th century. When the tunnel was completed and trains began to use it, Göschenen remained an important operational station. Trains paused here before entering the long underground section. Locomotives and crews had already worked steadily on the climb from the lower Reuss Valley, and the station provided time for ordinary railway attention before the next stage of the journey. On the platform, the station clock had a plain, round face. Its dark hands moved across clear markings beneath the glass. It suited the steam era station, simple and legible beneath its lamp. The famous Swiss railway clock with its red signal paddle second hand would appear much later, in the middle of the 20th century. That later design did not yet belong to this scene. Here the older clock quietly kept station time, marking the pause one calm minute after another. Beside the locomotive, the crew began their familiar checks. The driver looked at the gauges in the cab. Steam pressure needed to remain within its proper range, sufficient for the work ahead, yet always controlled. The fireman attended to the coal fire, spreading it evenly across the grate. A well-kept fire was not simply a bright one. It needed an even surface, so that air could pass through and heat the boiler steadily. The boiler water level was checked with equal care. Water within the boiler was heated to make the steam that moved the locomotive. The crew watched the level closely, keeping it neither too low nor too high. The gauge glass in the cab showed where the water stood. A railwayman walked beside the train, observing the wheels, axle boxes, hoses, and couplings. Each coupling held one vehicle securely to the next. The brakes were attended to as well, so that the train could be controlled as one connected whole. These were not theatrical preparations for an unusual challenge. They were part of ordinary professional railway routine. The work was performed economically and without fuss, shaped by training and long familiarity. Signals and line clearance were confirmed. The crew needed to know that the track ahead was ready and reserved for their train. Railway safety depended upon many people sharing clear and accurate information. Station staff, signalmen, drivers, firemen, and guards each had their part. Much of that work was quiet. A lever moved, a message was given, a signal changed its meaning, a hand was raised beneath a lamp. From these small, dependable actions, the railway journey continued. Passengers waited within the coaches while the checks were completed. The carriage lamps glowed softly above polished wood and woven seats. A gentle warmth rose from the heating pipes. Outside, the cold air made every little cloud of steam clearly visible. Someone adjusted a scarf. Someone else settled more deeply into a corner. A gloved hand rested near the window frame, while beyond the glass the station remained hushed beneath its covering of snow. The tunnel portal could be seen beyond the end of the platforms. Its stone arch framed a darkness that appeared smooth, sheltered, and still. The original Gotthard railway tunnel ran through the mountain toward Airolo on the southern side. Inside, the railway rose to its highest point, approximately 1,151 meters above sea level, and then began its descent toward the southern portal. That older tunnel was distinct from the Gotthard base tunnel built many generations later. The base tunnel opened in 2016. It extends for 57 kilometers along a much lower and flatter route, allowing modern trains to pass beneath the Alps with far less climbing. The tunnel before the waiting steam locomotive belonged to a different age. It was part of the 19th century mountain railway, shaped by the engineering methods and railway needs of its own time. Its route met the Alps at a higher level, after the long climb through the Reuss Valley and past Wassen. A soft tapping came from the locomotive cab as the firemen adjusted the coal. Steam stirred near the cylinders. Faint metallic warmth mingled with the clean scent of snow, and a thin cloud drifted beneath the station canopy before fading into the cold. The visible world had grown smaller since the open slopes below Wassen. Here the mountains stood close around the station. The platform lamps rested in pools of amber light. Beyond them lay a few sidings, dark roofs, damp rails, and the pale edges of snowbanks. Far above, hidden from view, the old pass crossed the ridge beneath the winter sky. It was easy to imagine that higher route lying silent for the season, its bends softened by snow. Below it, trains now waited at the mouth of the tunnel, ready to continue through stone rather than over the high mountain. For a few moments, everything remained in balance. The train was still, yet prepared to move. The fire burned quietly. Water waited within the boiler. Steam rested behind valves and pistons. The crew exchanged a few brief, familiar words, then returned to their places. Along the platform, doors were checked. A porter lifted his hand. The guard looked toward the signal, and then toward the locomotive. The plain station clock continued its steady passage from 1 minute to the next. The pause at Goshenen had been unhurried. It had allowed the engine to breathe after its climb, the crew to complete their routine, and the passengers to look once more upon the snowy valley before the mountain enclosed the line. Then at last the signal cleared. Windows were closed against the smoke and cold of the tunnel. Latches settled softly into place. As the pale outdoor light was shut away, the carriage lamps seemed to glow more warmly. Their reflections appeared in the glass, turning each window into a dark mirror edged with gold. The whistle gave one low, restrained note. Steam moved beneath the locomotive. The first coupling tightened, followed by the next, and then the next, passing the gentle pull from the front of the train to the rear. The wheels began to turn. Slowly, the locomotive carried its measured breath beyond the platform lamps. The plain clock, the waiting porter, the damp rails, and the snowy roofs slipped behind. Ahead, the stone arch grew larger, and the outside world narrowed to a final frame of winter light. Then the engine approached the northern portal of the Gotthard Tunnel, and the warm, lamplit carriages followed it toward the quiet shelter of the mountain. Chapter 8. Through the Gotthard Tunnel. The stone arch widened before the locomotive, and then quietly enclosed it. Daylight lingered for an instant upon the carriage windows, a narrow silver reflection, trembling in the glass. Then it slipped away. The train entered the mountain, and the warm lamps within the carriages became the gentlest light in sight. The first sounds were clear and separate. There was the turning of wheels, the soft joining of rail after rail, and the measured breath of the engine ahead. Each sound returned from the tunnel walls in a subdued echo. The locomotive seemed to speak, and then to hear its own voice come back, softer than before. The windows had been closed, or nearly closed, before departure from Goshenen. In the age of steam, passage through a long tunnel was never perfectly fresh or clean. Smoke and soot followed the train beneath the stone, and warmth gathered gradually inside the carriages. A faint trace of coal smoke found its way through small gaps around a window frame. Yet the passengers were prepared. Coats were loosened, scarves were folded and placed beside gloved hands. Conversation lowered naturally, as though the shelter of the mountain encouraged softer voices. Beyond the glass little could be seen. An occasional lamp, a wet gleam or a pale mark upon the wall passed quickly and was gone. Inside, brass fittings held small points of golden light. A luggage rack cast a slender shadow across the ceiling. Passengers settled more deeply into the upholstered seats, listening as the rhythm rose and fell. Wheel upon rail, breath of steam, echo upon stone. The original Gotthard Summit Tunnel runs between Goshenen on the northern side of the Alps and Airolo on the southern side. It is approximately 14.9 kilometers long, usually rounded to 15 kilometers. When it opened in 1882, it was the longest railway tunnel in the world. Construction had begun 10 years earlier, in 1872. Workers advanced inward from both portals. One group began at Goshenen, while another began at Airolo. Between them stood many kilometers of mountain rock. There was no opening through which one group could see the other, and so careful surveying was essential. Direction and height had to be measured with great precision, guiding the two tunnel headings toward their eventual meeting place. The work relied upon important technologies of the period. Compressed air drills bored holes into the rock. Dynamite opened each new section. Pumps removed water. Small construction locomotives carried broken stone away, and water-powered compressors supplied the drills with air. The work moved forward through patient repetition. Holes were bored. Explosives were placed. Rock was cleared and water was pumped away. Then the same demanding process began again, a little farther inside the mountain. The headings from north and south finally met. After years of surveying, calculation, and labor, the two routes joined within the rock. The tunnel received its ceremonial inauguration on 22nd of May, 1482. Regular operation over the completed route began on 1 June of that year. The achievement was remarkable, though it came at a grave human cost. Conditions during construction were extremely difficult. Workers endured heat, water, smoke, dust, illness, poor ventilation, and inadequate living conditions. At least 199 workers died during the building of the tunnel. The full cost extended beyond that documented number through illness and exhaustion. Many of those who labored here were migrants, especially Italians. The Gotthard Railway was not built by Swiss workers alone. It was also shaped by people who had crossed borders to undertake demanding work, far from home. The carriage lamps continued their quiet glow. Remembering those workers did not disturb the stillness. Instead, it gave the passage a deeper meaning. Every wheel now turning through the completed tunnel followed a way made possible by their knowledge, strength, labor, and endurance. The finished tunnel carried 2 tracks, allowing trains to travel in opposite directions. Its floor did not remain at exactly one level. From each portal, the line rose gently toward a summit within the mountain, and then descended again. This shape helped water drain toward the portals rather than gathering at the center. The highest point of the original Gotthard Railway lies here, inside the summit tunnel, approximately 1,151 meters above sea level. There was no clear sign to the passengers that the train had reached that hidden height. No distant view opened beyond a window. No ridge, snowfield, or mountain marker announced the summit. It was experienced only through motion. The engine's effort eased almost imperceptibly. The beat of the exhaust changed. Then the train began its gentle descent toward the southern portal. The locomotive continued carefully. Its fire remained bright beyond the carriages, turning water into steam and maintaining the steady pull of the train. Smoke drifted behind it, and ventilation remained imperfect, as it often was during steam-era tunnel travel. From time to time, a passenger raised a handkerchief to the nose, or brushed a speck of soot from a sleeve. These small gestures passed without alarm. The lamps remained steady. The wheels kept their dependable measure. Here and there, drops of water caught the light outside. They shone briefly against the stone before disappearing into darkness. The sound of the train changed with the surfaces of the tunnel. At times, the echo gathered closely around the carriages. At others, it seemed to recede, leaving only the nearer sounds. There was a faint creak of woodwork, the soft rustle of a newspaper, and the quiet breathing of passengers who had ceased speaking. The long passage changed the sense of distance. Outside, a traveler could follow the journey by villages, bridges, slopes, and church towers. Within the mountain, there were no such landmarks. Time became the repetition of the rails. Click and murmur, breath and echo. The tunnel joined more than 2 valleys. It created a dependable railway connection through the Central Alps, linking northern and southern Europe more directly. Passengers, letters, food, machinery, and ordinary goods could travel beneath the high pass, rather than following the longer road over the mountains. The line became part of a wider network of stations, cities, ports, and communities. Journeys that had once depended more heavily upon season and mountain weather could continue through the shelter of the rock. Inside the carriage, the warmth and steady movement invited rest. One passenger watched the reflection of the lamps in the dark window. Another placed gloved hands upon a folded coat. Someone leaned gently against the padded seat and closed their eyes, listening without needing to count the passing minutes. The conductor moved along the corridor with an even step. He paused to inspect a latch, then continued into the next carriage. His footsteps faded, absorbed by the larger rhythm of the train. Wheel upon rail, breath of steam, echo upon stone. The locomotive's exhaust now sounded a little less forceful as the line descended. The darkness remained complete, yet it no longer seemed unfamiliar. It had become a sheltered interval between 2 landscapes, a long warm pause beneath the snow-covered Alps. After many softened echoes, the darkness began to change. At first, the difference was no more than a thinning of blackness beyond the glass. A faint gray tone appeared where there had been only the reflection of the lamps. Then a cooler draft reached the carriage, carrying air from the far side of the mountain. Far ahead, a pale opening appeared, small and distant, framed by stone. With every turn of the wheels, it widened. The echoes loosened. The locomotive's voice traveled outward, and the enclosed sounds of the tunnel began to fall away. The lamps still glowed warmly behind the passengers. Before them waited winter light, southern snow, and Airolo on the other side of the Alps. Chapter 9. Airolo and the Southern Snow. The pale opening widened until it filled the forward windows. For a few moments the carriage lamps still seemed brighter than the world outside. Then the locomotive passed beneath the stone arch of the southern portal, and the long echoes of the tunnel loosened behind it. Open air returned softly. The wheels sounded clearer upon the rails. Steam drifted freely instead of curling along the tunnel roof, and the engine's measured exhaust rose once more into the broad mountain sky. Passengers looked through the windows as their eyes adjusted to daylight. Nothing had changed all at once. Snow still lay deep beside the track. High slopes still rose on either side, and dark forests crossed the mountains in quiet bands. Winter had accompanied the train through the tunnel. Yet there were small differences to notice. The light seemed to fall at another angle. It touched the upper ridges with a pale, warmer tone, while the snow on the valley floor remained blue in the shade. Roofs cast deep shadows upon plastered walls. A few windows reflected a silvery brightness. Beyond the railway buildings, the settlement of Airolo rested beneath the mountains. The station name appeared in clear letters, Airolo. The word was gentle when spoken aloud, its open vowels carried easily along the platform. A railway worker called the name, and a station announcement followed in Italian. The familiar sounds of railway routine had entered another of Switzerland's languages. Airolo lies in the canton of Ticino, the Italian-speaking region of the country. Switzerland has several national languages, shaped partly by geography and by long histories of settlement and exchange. North of the Gotthard, German is heard most often. Here, on the southern side, Italian appeared on signs, timetables, shop fronts, and station notices. The transition was not a boundary drawn sharply across the snow. Railway staff could speak more than one language, as could many passengers who regularly traveled through the Alps. A conductor might offer directions in German, then repeat them in Italian. A traveler from farther away might listen for a familiar place name and understand the rest from a gesture toward the platform or the carriage door. The heritage locomotive rolled slowly beside the station, its dark wheels turned through the cold air, and steam gathered near the lower steps of the carriages. After its long passage beneath the mountain, the engine seemed to breathe more freely. Airolo stands at roughly 1,140 meters above sea level, high enough for winter to remain firmly present. Snow rested on the station canopy and filled sheltered corners beside the walls. It softened the edges of sheds, fences, and luggage carts. On the shaded side of the valley, it already held the cool color of evening, although daylight still touched the higher ground. Ticino is often associated with lakeside towns, mild gardens, and Mediterranean influences. Those qualities become clearer farther downhill. Here at Airolo, close to the main chain of the Alps, the landscape remained unmistakably mountainous. There was no instant release from winter. The southern change revealed itself gradually, through language, building details, food, and the way sunlight reached the slopes. The train came to rest with a soft settling of couplings. Along the platform stood buildings with pale plaster walls and dark stone around their lower edges. Broad, shadowed roofs protected doorways and windows from snow. Their practical forms belonged to mountain life, while certain colors and proportions quietly suggested places farther south. A wooden door opened, releasing a brief glow from within the station. The scent of coffee reached the carriage. It mingled with coal smoke and cold air, bringing a small sense of warmth. Somewhere nearby, bread had been cut into thick slices. In the waiting room, a bowl of broth sent a slender ribbon of steam toward the window. These simple fragrances drifted through the station whenever a door opened and closed. One passenger stepped down and stood beside the carriage, stretching after the long tunnel. Another remained by the window, watching the railway workers move with practiced calm. One worker examined the line of wheels. Another spoke briefly with the driver. Their quiet words were accompanied by the faint ticking of metal and the gentle breathing of the locomotive. Above Airolo, partly hidden by the winter slopes, lay the road over the Gotthard Pass. For centuries, people had crossed the mountains overhead, following paths and roads that climbed toward the pass before descending on the other side. The route was valuable, but demanding, especially when snow covered the high ground. One of the most remarkable old roads on the southern approach is the Tremola. It descends toward Airolo through many close bends, folding back and forth across the slope. Its winding shape allowed travelers, horses, and later vehicles to lose height more gradually than they could on a direct descent. From a distance, the road can resemble a narrow ribbon laid carefully upon the mountain. In winter, much of that high route belongs to snow and silence. The railway tunnel below offered another way through, sheltered within the rock. Here at Airolo, the old pass road and the railway seemed to express the same enduring wish, to cross the Alps with patience, skill, and respect for the land. A whistle sounded, softened by the surrounding snow. Doors were closed one by one. The conductor looked along the platform and raised a hand. Steam stirred beneath the locomotive, and the train began to move. At first, the wheels turned almost too slowly to hear. Then the familiar rhythm returned. Click and roll, breath of steam, click and roll. The station slipped behind. Its nameboard remained visible for another moment before Airolo's roofs settled into the valley. Farther back, the southern portal became a small dark arch at the foot of the mountain. Beyond Airolo, the railway entered the upper Leventina Valley. The line followed the valley as it began its long descent through Ticino. Here the land was still high, enclosed by snowy peaks. White meadows lay between clusters of buildings. Stone walls appeared as low, dark lines where the snow had thinned. Water moved beneath ice at the edges of a stream, continuing southward through the valley. For generations, the Leventina had served as a route between the Alpine heights and the lower country. Villages developed where the land allowed farms, roads, and crossings to meet. Church towers rose above grouped roofs, providing familiar landmarks in a valley where distance could be measured from one settlement to the next. Inside the carriage, conversation became a quiet mixture of sounds. An elderly traveler read an Italian newspaper beneath the lamp. Across the aisle, two passengers spoke softly in German about the tunnel. The conductor answered a question in Italian, then offered a few words in French. No one seemed surprised. In this Alpine railway setting, languages traveled together. They passed gently from platform to carriage, from one valley to the next, while the steady wheels kept their own simple rhythm beneath them all. Outside, late light rested on the upper ridges. It was not the warmth of another season, but it carried a subdued golden color. Lower down, the valley floor was already turning blue. Chimney smoke rose above a farmhouse, forming a straight gray column before spreading into the still air. The locomotive continued at an unhurried pace. Steam trailed over the first carriage and faded. Snow remained gathered on roofs, walls, and quiet fields, preserving the calm continuity of the winter journey. Yet the softer vowels of the station names and the warmer tone of the highlight suggested that the train was now traveling south. It would go only a little farther into the upper Leventina. As the track curved, a small mountain station appeared ahead beneath a canopy weighted with snow. A clock waited beneath the eaves, lamps had begun to glow behind the windows, and a luggage cart stood neatly beside the wall. Twilight gathered around the platform while the rails shone in two narrow lines. The locomotive gave one low whistle, wheel upon rail, breath of steam. The warm carriages moved quietly toward the waiting station. Chapter 10. Evening at a Mountain Station. The low whistle faded into the upper Leventina, passing softly among dark fir trees and snow-covered roofs. Beneath the station canopy, two lamps shone over the platform. Their light rested on a waiting luggage cart, a row of boot prints, and the plain face of the clock beneath the eaves. The locomotive approached at little more than walking pace. First came the gentle turning of wheels. Then there was the faint brush of the brakes. Steam drifted low beside the rails, spreading in pale folds beneath the canopy. The carriages followed one by one, their windows glowing amber in the blue of evening. The brakes eased. The wheels turned more slowly. At last the train came to rest. The couplings between the carriages settled with a sequence of quiet sounds, each one softer than the last. A lamp swayed in the guard's compartment. Somewhere beneath the train, a metal rod shifted gently into place. The locomotive released a long breath of steam, and the station seemed to gather around it. There was the building, the platform, the waiting snow, and the mountain slopes rising beyond the lamps. This was the arranged stopping place for the imagined heritage excursion. It was a small, unnamed station inspired by historic stocks around Ambri, Piota, and Rodi Fieso in the upper Leventina. It was not meant to suggest a present-day steam timetable or to represent a standard historic terminus. It was simply a peaceful place where this particular journey could pause as evening settled over the valley. Here, passengers and parcels could leave the train, messages could be exchanged, papers could be checked, the locomotive and carriages could be inspected before the day's work came to an end. A station worker stepped beneath the canopy in a dark wool coat. He carried a hand lamp whose flame glowed behind glass. After greeting the driver, he turned toward the guard who had descended with a folder of papers tucked beneath one arm. Railway work was made from many such quiet exchanges. Tickets might be counted, notes about the train might be read and signed, messages from neighboring stations could report whether a section of track was clear, whether another train was expected, or whether some routine task had been completed farther along the line. Nothing appeared hurried, yet everything required attention. Railway time mattered greatly. Train movements had to be coordinated across both single-track and double-track sections. A locomotive could not simply leave whenever its crew wished. Each movement had to fit safely with all the others, and every train needed its proper place upon the railway. Under the eaves, the plain station clock marked the minutes without ornament. Its dark hands moved over a pale face. It was not the later Swiss Federal Railway's clock with its familiar red second hand, which belonged to the middle of the 20th century. This simpler clock suited the late steam atmosphere of the platform. Its task, however, was important. The guard's watch, the station clock, and the clocks at neighboring stops all helped the railway keep its dependable rhythm. Near the end of the platform, a signal lamp made a small point of color against the snow. Depending on the station and the period, railway signals might have used mechanical arms, lamps, or a combination of the two. Some points, the mechanisms that guided wheels from one track to another, might be worked nearby. Others could be controlled from a signal cabin or another protected position. Not every signal or point would necessarily have been operated by hand from the platform. Arrangements differed from station to station and changed over time, yet the need remained the same. Railway work was dependable because people continued to watch, check, communicate, and confirm. The carriage doors opened, and the passengers began to step down. A porter placed a short stool beside one carriage and offered a hand to an elderly traveler. A family gathered beneath the canopy while their trunk was lowered into the snow-muted evening. 2 canvas mail bags followed, then a wooden parcel tied neatly with cord. Farther along, metal milk cans were lifted onto a hand trolley. Parcels, mail, trunks, and milk cans were all familiar kinds of traffic at stations serving mountain communities. They made their journey alongside the passengers, carried from one stopping place to the next, through valleys and beneath the high slopes. The trolley wheels made a low, hollow rumble over the platform stones. Where loose snow covered the ground, even that sound faded. Footsteps became soft impressions. Voices seemed to remain close to the people speaking, as though the snow gathered each word and held it gently. The station staff moved without haste, but every movement had a purpose. One worker examined the carriage lamps. Another walked beside the train, looking over the wheels and brake equipment. He paused beside the couplings, checking that everything remained properly arranged. The beam of his lantern moved across the steel, rested for a moment on a wheel rim, and then disappeared beneath the carriage frames. At the locomotive, the driver and fireman made their own inspection. Even at rest, the engine was not entirely silent. Small threads of steam escaped and vanished into the cold air. Its great metal body had been warmed through many hours of travel, and now it began to cool by degrees. As the hot metal contracted, the locomotive gave a series of faint ticking sounds. Tick. Then quiet. Another tick, somewhere deeper within the engine. It was like a clock hidden inside the warm iron and steel, measuring a slower kind of time. Beyond the platform doors lay the waiting room. It was a modest space, with wooden benches along the walls, and a stove giving out a steady warmth. Damp coats hung from pegs, carrying the quiet scent of wet wool. The stove added the dry fragrance of heated iron and wood. From nearby came the gentle smell of warm food. Several passengers entered for a few minutes. Snow loosened from their boots and melted into dark marks beside the threshold. A woman unwrapped a small piece of bread and cheese. A child sat near the window, watching steam pass slowly across the glass. At a table, the conductor checked his papers beneath a shaded lamp. The room did not feel separate from the railway. The station clock could still be heard. Outside, the hand trolley passed with a muted rolling sound. Now and then the door opened and admitted a narrow ribbon of cold air, along with the distant hiss of the locomotive. Then the door closed softly. Warmth gathered once more around the benches. On a shelf stood several parcels awaiting collection. One bore an address written in careful ink. Another was wrapped in brown paper, softened slightly at the corners. Nearby were the mail bags brought in from the platform and placed safely beneath shelter. Each item had its own destination. Each was part of the station's evening routine. Outside, twilight deepened over the upper valley. The snow-covered ground became pale beneath the lamps, while the fir trees and mountain slopes darkened beyond them. The rails continued through the station in two narrow shining lines before disappearing into the dusk. The empty luggage cart returned along the platform. Its wheels rattled gently over the stones and then fell silent when it reached the station wall. The porter lowered the handle with care and left the cart neatly beneath the canopy, ready for another day. The trunk had gone with its owner. The parcels had been set down. The mailbags had been carried inside. The milk cans stood together beneath shelter, waiting quietly for the next stage of their journey. The station worker exchanged a final word with the guard. Their voices were low and unhurried. A page was turned. A note was checked. From the office came the soft sound of a door settling into its frame. At the end of the platform, the signal lamp continued to glow, keeping its calm watch over the snow and rails. The plane clock beneath the eaves moved onward, minute by minute. One by one, the passengers found their evening places. Some followed the village road toward warm rooms, their footsteps softened by the snow. Others remained in the carriages for a little longer, surrounded by polished wood, woolen seats, and shaded lamps. Inside the waiting room, coats slowly dried beside the stove. A last cup was set down. A bench creaked gently as someone rose. The door opened, then closed, and the small pocket of warmth became still. Outside, steam drifted beneath the canopy. The platform lamp shone through it, turning the vapor pale gold for a moment before it faded into the blue evening air. Snow rested on the station roof, on the luggage cart, and along the dark edges of the track. The station's work was nearly complete. On a siding beside the platform, the locomotive waited beneath a light covering of falling snow. Its fire would soon be banked, arranged to burn slowly through the quiet hours. Steam thinned above the chimney. Along the cooling boiler came the steady, delicate ticking of contracting metal. The final parcels were safe. The last passengers had found warm rooms or quiet seats. Beyond the lamps, the mountains gathered the remaining blue light of evening, and beside the little station, the locomotive rested, waiting for its fire to be banked beneath the deepening night.